The room fell silent the moment I walked in. My father smirked, leaning slightly toward my mother as if we were still sitting in the old church pew on Sunday mornings, and I was the child who forgot to keep her dress clean. "At least she found a nice uniform to wear," he muttered. A few guests tried not to laugh. You could hear the sound of stifled chuckles, the kind that die in the throat when shame starts to taste real. The officiant, an older man in a judge's robe, paused mid-sentence. His eyes widened when he saw the silver stars on my shoulders. His voice faltered, then came out in a whisper that carried through the whole room. "To Major General." And just like that, time froze. Every head turned toward me. My father's grin fell away. My mother blinked as if she'd seen a ghost. For the first time in my life, my family knew who I really was. That's how it started the silence after 20 years of noise. 2 weeks earlier, I'd been trimming the overgrown hedges in my small Norfolk yard when a letter arrived. Cream-colored paper embossed Seal County Courthouse. I thought it was a mistake until I read the words Carter versus Carter, petition for property division. My parents were suing me. For a while, I just stared at the envelope sitting on the porch steps with dirt on my hands, and my old shepherd Knox resting his head on my knee. The air smelled like salt and diesel from the shipyard a few miles away. Somewhere down the block, a neighbor's flag clinked against its pole. I couldn't help but laugh, not the happy kind, but the dry, hollow kind that sounds like disbelief. "Guess they finally found another way to talk to me," I murmured to Knox. He thumped his tail once like he understood. It had been 12 years since I left home. The last time I saw my parents, I was in fatigues, not dress blues. I'd just finished BUD/S, the toughest training in the Navy SEAL pipeline. Dad hadn't come to graduation. Mom sent a text that said, "We raised a daughter, not a soldier." I stopped expecting them to understand anything after that. I spent years deployed overseas logistics extractions operations nobody read about on the news. I wasn't the hero people wrote stories about. I was the one who made sure everyone got home. That was enough for me. Then an IED blast tore through our convoy in Al Huda. I came home with a rebuilt knee, a limp, and a pension check that reminded me every month what I'd lost. But I kept going, bought a little house, fixed it up myself, kept my service quiet. And then that letter came. The next morning I called the courthouse. A clerk's voice came through the phone, polite but cold. "Yes, ma'am. Your parents are petitioning to have the family property transferred to them on grounds of abandonment." "Abandonment," I repeated. "I was serving overseas." She hesitated. "Ma'am, you'll need to appear in person if you wish to contest it." When the call ended, I sat for a long time staring at the phone. Abandonment. That was the same word my father used the night I enlisted. "You're abandoning your family," he'd said, his hands still black with grease from the garage. "No, Dad," I told him. "I'm just trying to serve something bigger than myself." He never forgave me for that. A few days later, I drove back to the town I swore I'd never see again. Portsmouth looked smaller than I remembered, half-empty storefronts, flags faded by the sun. The farmhouse sat at the end of a cracked dirt road, its porch sagging like tired shoulders. My grandfather built that house when he came home from Okinawa. He used to tell me, "Every board's got a story, Evie. Take care of the wood and it'll take care of you." He left it to me in his will. Now my parents wanted it back. I ran my hand along the railing. The paint flaked off like old skin, but under it, carved faintly into the wood, were 2 sets of initials, EC, his and mine. That night, I pulled out the old Navy chest from my closet. The uniform inside still smelled of salt and gun oil. Next to it lay a folded flag, the one they gave me after Chief Lewis, my best friend, didn't make it home. I hadn't worn the dress blues since his funeral. My hands trembled as I lifted it. Knox tilted his head as if asking why I'd take something sacred out of its place. I smiled faintly. Guess it's time they saw who I really became. The hearing date fell on the same weekend as my cousin's wedding, the ceremony where my father would smirk. I figured if I was going to drive 3 hours to be humiliated, I might as well wear the one thing he couldn't mock. The morning of the hearing, the sky was low and heavy, that gray Virginia kind of day that smells like wet asphalt. I pulled on the uniform piece by piece, the jacket tighter than I remembered, the metals cold against my skin. Every motion felt deliberate, like closing the pages of an unfinished story. When I looked in the mirror, I saw a woman I hadn't allowed myself to be in years, proud, composed, tired, but unbreakable. I whispered to my reflection, "Let's end this quietly." Knox barked once as I grabbed my keys. Maybe it was encouragement, maybe it was warning. Either way, I smiled. The drive to Portsmouth took less than an hour, but every mile felt longer than the last. The courthouse loomed just like it had when I was a kid, tagging along with my grandfather. Now it looked smaller, less like justice, more like a test. Inside, the floor smelled of wax and old paper. The clerk nodded when she saw me, eyes flicking to the ribbons on my chest. "Commander Carter," she said softly. The title caught me off guard. I hadn't heard it spoken in months. When I walked into the courtroom, the first thing I saw was my father's broad shoulders, stiff, proud, unyielding. My mother sat beside him, her purse clutched in her lap like a lifeline. They didn't look up when I entered. The judge glanced over his glasses, his expression neutral. "Commander Carter, you may take your seat." The word hung there for a moment, Commander. It rolled through the room like a wave. Dad's head snapped up. His jaw worked, but no sound came out. Mom's lips parted. Even the lawyer hesitated. For the first time in years, they didn't know what to say. And for the first time in my life, I didn't need them to. The night after that first court hearing, I sat in my kitchen long after the lights of the neighborhood had gone dark. Knox was asleep on the floor, his paws twitching in some dream that probably smelled of open fields and freedom. My uniform hung neatly on the back of the chair, creased, gleaming uncomfortably honest. I hadn't worn it in years, and now it sat there like a question I finally had the courage to answer. It had been 12 years since I last drove through the town line of Portsmouth, but the memories still clung to me like the smell of motor oil on Dad's work shirts. In this town, people measured pride in tools, trophies, and family reputation. I'd left to find something larger, but somehow that made me smaller in their eyes. My father used to say, "The world doesn't owe you anything, Evelyn." And he was right. But I didn't owe him silence either. When the summons came 2 weeks ago, it didn't feel like war, it felt like a dare. I'd spent years fixing things, broken engines, broken teams, even broken soldiers. But family. That was one thing I couldn't patch together with discipline and torque. I picked up the envelope again, smoothing the edges flat. Carter versus Carter. Plaintiffs Robert and Margaret Carter, defendant Evelyn Carter. It was absurd on paper, but real enough to sting. I'd been paying the property taxes for a decade quietly through automatic transfer from my Navy account. But they hadn't known that, or hadn't wanted to. What they wanted was control. And maybe finally I was old enough not to give it to them. The courthouse clerk had said it plainly on the phone, "Ma'am, your parents are petitioning to have the property transferred to them on the grounds of abandonment." Abandonment, I'd repeated like the word itself could bite back. That word had been my father's favorite weapon. He first used it the night I enlisted. I still remember the smell of gasoline from his shop that summer, the concrete floor slick with oil, the radio humming some country song about staying home. I'd just finished my application for the Navy program, trembling from equal parts excitement and fear. When I told him, he threw the wrench he'd been holding, the clang echoing off the walls like a gunshot. "You're abandoning your family," he'd said, red-faced and shaking. "No, Dad. I'm serving my country." He jabbed a finger toward my chest. "You think you're better than the rest of us because you wear a fancy uniform. Don't come crying back when it breaks you." That was the night I packed a small duffel bag and walked out. Mom didn't stop me. She just stood at the kitchen sink drying the same plate over and over like she could scrub away the noise. When I got on the bus to Great Lakes the next morning, I looked back once and saw her standing in the doorway, still small and wordless. That image would stay with me for years, the way regret always does. Now, decades later, I sat at my kitchen table under the buzz of a single bulb, tracing the rim of my coffee mug with one finger. The house around me was quiet, but alive. Every creak in the floorboard, every ticking of the clock, a reminder that peace can sound strange after years of command briefings and midnight alarms. The idea of facing them again didn't scare me, it exhausted me. I'd spent too many years learning how to remain calm when chaos erupted. But this wasn't combat. This was family, and family had a way of wounding deeper than bullets ever could. Still, something in me hardened that night. Maybe it was the same instinct that had kept me alive overseas. Maybe it was just time. Either way, I decided I wouldn't walk into that courthouse as their daughter. I'd walk in as the woman I'd become, the one they never cared to meet. The morning sun rose over the Chesapeake like a slow promise. I brewed another pot of coffee and went out to the porch. The sea breeze was cool, sharp, carrying the faint sound of ships leaving port. For a moment I closed my eyes and let it wash over me. That scent salt metal engine oil was home in a way my childhood house had never been. Knox limped outside, sat by my chair and leaned into my leg. He'd been with me through everything from deployment to recovery, from surgeries to sleepless nights. His muzzle was gray now, but his eyes were still sharp and kind. I scratched behind his ears and said, "We're going home, boy, just for a little while." He groaned as if to say he'd heard that lie before. The drive to Portsmouth took less than an hour, but with every passing mile the weight of 12 years pressed down harder. The interstate signs felt like ghosts. Exit 242, the gas station where Dad taught me to drive stick. Maple Creek Road, the turnoff to the farmhouse my grandfather built after the war. That house wasn't just a building. It was history nailed together by his bare hands. He'd been the only one who believed in me, the only one who said, "Eve, when you find your calling, don't ask permission to answer it." When he passed, the house came to me through his will. Dad never said it out loud, but I knew it burned him. His father choosing me, the one who left over the son who stayed. Now they wanted to take it back, not because they needed it, but because they couldn't stand the idea that I'd been chosen for something, anything. The town looked different when I arrived, smaller, quieter edges dulled by time. The diner still stood on the corner, its neon sign flickering the same tired EAT that had glowed since I was a kid. I parked across the street, engine idling, and just watched for a moment. The same waitress from 20 years ago shuffled between tables. The world hadn't moved even if I had. When I reached the farmhouse, my breath caught. The porch sagged deeper, the paint peeled, and weeds had swallowed the path. But beneath the decay, it still looked like what my grandfather built, a place meant to last longer than resentment. I climbed the steps and brushed away the dust on the doorframe. Beneath the grime, 2 sets of initials faintly carved into the wood caught the light, EC, his and mine, side by side. It stopped me cold. The memory was so vivid I could almost hear his laugh. "Names fade, Eve," he used to say. But values stay. I stood there for a long time before heading back to my car. The house wasn't just my inheritance, it was the proof that someone once had seen who I was becoming. That night back home, I opened my old Navy chest again. The uniform lay folded perfectly untouched since the day I retired. The fabric still carried that faint metallic scent, the ocean, the engine room, the blood of discipline and loss. Next to it, the folded flag they'd handed me at Chief Lewis's memorial service. My throat tightened as I ran my fingers over the creases. "I'm not wearing this for pride," I said aloud. "I'm wearing it for truth." Knox looked up, tail-thumping once in quiet approval. The next morning I pressed the uniform and packed it into a garment bag. It felt like sealing a promise. When I zipped it closed, I whispered, "Let's show them what they built by trying to break." 2 days later, I stood outside the courthouse steps under a sky the color of steel. My reflection stared back from the glass doors, uniform crisp ribbons aligned, expression steady. I'd come for a hearing. I didn't know yet it would turn into something far bigger, a reckoning. When the bailiff called my case, Carter versus Carter, docket number 4238B, the courtroom went quiet, as if even the air had chosen to hold its breath. I rose slowly. The knee that had never fully healed from Al-Huda ached with every step, but I walked steady, not to impress anyone, just because I'd earned that steadiness the hard way. The medals on my chest caught the light as I crossed the aisle, the click of my heels echoing off the wood-paneled walls. Dad looked up first. His expression shifted from smug curiosity to something closer to disbelief. Mom's face, usually composed and polite, went pale. She clutched her pearls like the old days whenever she thought something shameful might happen in public. The judge, older mustached, steady in posture, adjusted his glasses and nodded to me. "Commander Evelyn Carter," he said, voice level, but faintly respectful. "Good morning, ma'am." That one word, commander, hung in the air like thunder waiting to roll. I didn't look at my parents. I didn't need to. The judge began. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter, You claim your daughter abandoned the family property 12 years ago, correct? Dad leaned forward, shoulders squared. Yes, Your Honor. That house has been sitting empty for years. We kept the place running, repairs, upkeep, taxes. Everything. That last word stung. Everything. The judge nodded. Understood. And Commander Carter, do you have a statement? I stood smoothing the front of my jacket. Yes, Your Honor, I do. My voice came out calm, trained even. I opened the folder I'd brought, years of property tax receipts, repair invoices, and bank transfer logs. Each one bore my name and signature. I've maintained the property since my grandfather passed, I said. My parents haven't paid a cent. The taxes were deducted directly from my Navy account until I retired. After that, from my pension. I placed the folder on the bench. The judge flipped through the pages, brow furrowing slightly. Everything seems in order, he murmured. Dad shifted, his jaw tightening. You think that uniform gives you the right to... Mr. Carter, the judge interrupted sharply. You'll address this court respectfully. For once, Dad went silent. His glare, though, stayed fixed on me, the same glare I'd seen when I was 18 and told him I was leaving. When it was Mom's turn to speak, her voice came out small and brittle. She left without saying goodbye, Your Honor. We thought she didn't care. Something inside me softened for just a second, not enough to forgive, but enough to understand. She wasn't angry. She was afraid. Afraid of being left behind, afraid of being wrong. I cared, I said quietly. I just learned to stop expecting that it went both ways. Her eyes flickered, but she said nothing more. As the hearing went on, the room became a strange battlefield, not of words, but of silence. Dad threw glances that said everything he wouldn't dare say out loud, traitor, ungrateful show-off. But I'd faced worse. I'd stood in briefing rooms where lives hung on my commands. I'd watched people die because orders came seconds too late. A glare from my father wasn't going to break me. At one point the judge paused, looking over the paperwork again. Commander Carter, he said slowly. For the record, are you the same, Evelyn Carter, recognized by the Secretary of Defense in 2019? A faint murmur rippled through the courtroom. Yes, sir, I said. Dad frowned. Recognized for what? The judge looked up, his tone respectful now. The Yemen evacuation. The joint naval rescue during the flood crisis. 43 civilians extracted under hostile conditions. I remember the commendation ceremony. You could have heard a pin drop. I didn't move, didn't smile, didn't look at them. Dad's face turned the color of weathered concrete. Mom pressed her hand to her mouth. The lawyer tried to pretend he was reading something, but his eyes never left me. When the session adjourned for the day, the judge didn't make a ruling yet. I'll review the evidence further, he said. We'll reconvene in 48 hours. I gathered my papers calmly. My father muttered something, but I couldn't hear the words over the rustle of the bailiff's uniform. Mom stayed seated, her fingers twisting the hem of her skirt. As I turned to leave, the judge spoke again, not loud, just enough for the front row to hear. My God, he murmured. Is that really her? The same words he'd say again later at the ceremony. Outside, the Virginia air felt thick and heavy. I stepped into the sunlight, blinking at the brightness. A few people in the hallway gave polite nods, the kind strangers give to someone they suddenly realized deserves respect. By the time I reached the parking lot, the tension in my shoulders had eased slightly. Knox was waiting in the passenger seat, tail thumping against the door. Come on, boy, I said, patting his head. We've done harder things than this. I sat for a while before starting the car. From the rearview mirror, I could still see the courthouse small brick, almost fragile-looking against the open sky. Funny how something so ordinary could hold so much history, so much pain. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked out onto the porch with a blanket around my shoulders and sat there listening to the crickets. The stars above Norfolk were faint but steady, the kind you had to look past city lights to see. I thought about my grandfather again. About how he used to sit right here on this same porch carving wood after dinner. His old Navy cap always hung by the door, his favorite saying carved into the post. Honor doesn't always look like victory. Back then I didn't understand it, now I did. Winning in that courtroom wouldn't make me whole again. It wouldn't fix the years of silence or the words I'd swallowed. but maybe, just maybe, it could remind me that I hadn't become what they believed. 2 days later, I drove back to Portsmouth. Same courthouse, same judge, same parents sitting stiff-backed at the table like they'd been waiting their whole lives to prove me wrong. The clerk called the case again, Carter versus Carter. The judge entered, adjusted his glasses, and looked at me for a long moment. "Commander Carter," he said, "welcome back." Dad flinched at the word commander again, like it cut deeper each time he heard it. I took my seat spine straight, hands still. The judge began reading through the summary of evidence. I could feel the eyes of everyone in the gallery on me, small-town curiosity mixed with dawning realization. When the judge finally spoke, the words "petition denied," I didn't smile. I didn't even breathe for a moment. Dad stood abruptly, muttering, "You can't just—" "Sit down, Robert," Mom whispered, voice trembling. He didn't, not at first, but when the bailiff stepped forward, he sank back into his chair, defeated. The judge's gavel struck once sharp as a gunshot. "This court finds no grounds for property transfer. The house remains in Commander Carter's possession." The sound echoed clean, final, almost sacred. I gathered my folder, nodded once to the judge, and walked out. The hallway outside smelled like old paper and dust, but to me it smelled like freedom. By the time I reached the parking lot, my reflection in the car window looked different, not younger, not lighter, just more certain. For the first time, I realized I didn't need to prove anything anymore. Knox barked once when I opened the door. I laughed softly. "Yeah, boy," I said, rubbing his head. "It's over." But deep down, I knew it wasn't really over. Not yet. There was still that look in my father's eyes. The one that said, "You may have won the case, but you haven't won me." And maybe, I wasn't sure I wanted to. The morning after the verdict, I woke to the sound of rain tapping against the window, soft, steady, like a memory that wouldn't leave. Knox stirred on the rug beside the bed, his ears twitching, then gave a low, lazy groan. Outside, the world smelled like wet earth and diesel, the kind of morning that makes old wounds ache. The house was quiet, but not the heavy kind of quiet that used to choke me after deployments. This was gentler, earned. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and stared at the uniform still hanging on the back of the chair. The jacket caught the faint gray light metals glinting like ghosts of all the lives and days stitched into them. For the first time in years, I didn't know what to do next. Winning the case hadn't felt like victory, just relief, like setting down a load you've carried too long. But as I looked around the kitchen, I realized I was standing in a life I'd built from ashes, no family, no platoon, just me and a dog with a limp. The world keeps moving even when your story gets stuck. Around 9, the phone rang. I hesitated before picking it up. "Commander Carter," a woman's voice said. It was the clerk from the courthouse. "Judge Simmons asked me to call. The written ruling's been filed. The property remains under your ownership." "I appreciate that," I said quietly. "Please thank the judge for his fairness." She paused. "Ma'am, my father served in the Navy. He used to talk about women like you, said you were tougher than most men he ever met." I smiled faintly, even though she couldn't see it. "Your father sounds like a smart man." When I hung up, I just stood there, hand still resting on the phone. Her words echoed longer than they should have. Women like you. I'd spent years hiding behind uniforms, titles, and silence. But maybe it wasn't hiding at all. Maybe it was surviving the only way I knew how. By noon, I found myself driving back to town half on impulse. The rain had eased, leaving the air heavy and clean. I stopped at the hardware store, picked up paint, sandpaper, new porch boards. If I was going to keep the farmhouse, I wasn't keeping it as a trophy. I was going to fix it. On my way out of the store, I froze. Across the lot, leaning against an old pickup, was my father. Hands in his pockets, cigarette smoldering between his fingers, the same stubborn slouch he'd carried my whole life. He didn't wave, just watched. I walked toward him slowly. "Guess we both had business in town," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. He took a drag, exhaled smoke through his nose. "You made quite a show yesterday." "It wasn't a show," I said. He gave a half smirk. "You didn't have to wear that uniform." I looked him straight in the eye. "I didn't wear it for you." The silence between us stretched like a tight rope. He flicked the cigarette into a puddle, watching it hiss. For a second, his face softened, almost unguarded. "You embarrassed your mother." I shrugged. "I think she embarrassed herself." He let out a dry laugh, the kind that isn't really laughter at all. You haven't changed a bit. Still think you're right about everything. No, I said quietly. I just stopped pretending I'm wrong. He turned as if to leave but paused halfway. His voice came out lower, this time rougher. You're like him, you know, your grandfather, too proud for your own good. For the first time I smiled small real. I'll take that as a compliment. He didn't answer, just nodded once, climbed into the truck and drove off. The sound of his engine faded down the road, leaving only the smell of rain and tobacco behind. That evening I drove out to the farmhouse. The ground was still damp puddles glinting like small mirrors under the gray sky. The porch sagged in the same spot it always had, the swing long gone, the windows clouded with dust. But it was still standing, so was I. I set down the paint cans and just stood there for a while, listening to the quiet. Then I rolled up my sleeves. It wasn't about nostalgia, it was about respect, about honoring the man who built it and the version of myself he believed in. As I pried up a rotted floorboard, something caught my eye, faint letters carved into the beam beneath, almost lost to time. EC, strength without anger. It wasn't my handwriting, it had to be his, my grandfather's. I ran my fingers over the letters, feeling the grooves under my skin. It hit me then, what I'd been chasing all these years wasn't pride or approval. It was steadiness. The kind of strength that doesn't shout. The kind that stands. Over the next few days, I worked on the house from sunrise to dusk. I replaced the porch boards, sanded the railings, scrubbed years of mildew from the windows. Every nail I drove felt like a conversation with him. Every creak of the floor sounded like an echo of who I used to be. At night, I'd sit on the steps with Knox beside me, coffee in hand, and watch the fireflies light up the field. It was quiet, so quiet it almost scared me. But it wasn't loneliness. It was peace. Still, there was one thing left undone. Late Friday afternoon, I saw another truck pull into the drive. This time it wasn't Dad's, it was Mom's. She stepped out slowly, still in her pearls, clutching something small in her hand. She walked up the path without a word and held it out to me. I found this in your grandfather's drawer, she said softly. It was a framed black and white photograph, him in his navy blues, one arm around a little girl with crooked pigtails. Me. I swallowed hard. He always said I had his eyes. She nodded, her voice trembling. He was proud of you, Evelyn, even when we didn't understand. Why didn't you, I asked, not accusing, just curious. She looked down at her shoes. Your father thought the military would change you, make you hard. I stared out across the yard. It did, but it also made me strong enough to forgive you. Her eyes filled, but she blinked the tears away. We sat together on the porch steps. As the light turned gold, the world wrapped in that soft evening stillness that comes after a storm. Before leaving, she touched my sleeve, brushing away a bit of sawdust. He doesn't know how to talk to you, she said quietly. He only knows how to argue. I almost smiled. Yeah, I noticed. She hesitated at the door. You should come by Sunday. Dinner's at 6. Your father might actually be home. It wasn't much, but in our family that invitation was an olive branch. I'll think about it, I said. When her car disappeared down the dirt road, I sat there for a long time holding the old photograph. My grandfather's smile seemed to look straight through time, patient and knowing. The air smelled of fresh paint and pine. For the first time in decades, I didn't feel like I was fighting anyone, not even myself. I turned to Knox and whispered, maybe we'll go to dinner after all. He wagged his tail, once slow and approving. Sunday came sooner than I expected. The morning sky was pale gray, draped in thin drizzle that misted the windows and turned the fields into soft watercolor. Knox followed me from room to room, his nails clicking on the floorboards, as if to ask whether I really intended to go. I kept glancing at the clock like a rookie waiting for deployment orders, ridiculous for a dinner invite from my own parents. But after 12 years, stepping back into that house felt harder than facing any mission I'd ever led. The uniform hung neatly on the back of a chair. Not the full dress blues this time, just the khaki service uniform, clean and simple. I didn't want to make a statement. I just wanted to walk in as myself. I stood in front of the mirror, smoothing the fabric, tucking a loose strand of hair behind my ear. My reflection looked older, steadier, but still the same girl who once sat on those courthouse benches waiting to be dismissed. Maybe this time I was ready to be seen, not judged, not defended, just seen. Knox tilted his head as I grabbed the car keys. "You coming?" I asked. He barked once, which for him meant absolutely not. I laughed and scratched his head. "All right, stay on guard duty. I'll be back before dark." The drive out to my parents' place was quiet. Country radio hummed in the background, some old song about time and forgiveness, while the wipers brushed slow arcs across the windshield. The fields on both sides had turned that late autumn gold that only Virginia knows, soft fading yet stubbornly alive. When I turned onto the familiar gravel road, my hands tightened on the steering wheel. The barn still leaned slightly to one side, the paint flaking to a tired brown. The windmill creaked faintly in the distance. The house itself looked smaller, more fragile, as if time had finally caught up to it too. I parked beside Dad's truck, turned off the engine, and just sat there for a moment. 12 years, I thought. 12 years of missed birthdays, empty holidays, and silence you could measure in miles. I took a breath, opened the door, and stepped out into the cool air. Mom answered before I even knocked. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and smiled faintly, like she'd been standing by the door for a while. "You came," she said. Her voice was softer than I remembered, not tired, just fragile in a way that made me ache a little. "Dinner's at 6, I replied, glancing at my watch. Didn't want to be late. Her smile deepened. "Your father's out back. Go on in." The smell hit me first, roast chicken, baked corn, and something sweet, maybe apple cobbler. It was the same smell that used to fill the house on Sundays when Grandpa was still alive. For a second the years fell away, and I was a kid again, sitting at the table, swinging my legs under the chair, listening to Dad talk about engines and fishing and how proud he was of Ryan. Never me. I shook off the memory and walked to the back porch. Dad was sitting on the steps oiling an old Winchester rifle. It wasn't loaded, just one of the many things he kept spotless, as though order could replace peace. He didn't look up when I approached. "Thought you wouldn't show," he said finally. "I almost didn't," I admitted. He nodded, still rubbing the cloth along the barrel. "Your mother said you might." We sat in silence for a while. Rain tapped lightly on the tin roof, steady and unhurried. The quiet between us wasn't hostile anymore, just uncertain, like we were both waiting for the other to break it. "You kept the house," he said after a while. I did. "Gonna live there?" "Maybe," I said. "Need some work first." He paused, the cloth still in his hand. "He'd be glad you're taking care of it." "I think so too," I said softly. "He always believed in finishing what you start." Dad set the rifle aside and looked straight at me for the first time in years. His eyes weren't angry, just worn like old leather that had weathered too many storms. "You think I was wrong," he said. I took a slow breath. "I think you were scared. You wanted a daughter who stayed close. You got one who went far." His jaw tightened. "You nearly got yourself killed." "I know," I said evenly, "but I also helped people live." He leaned back, staring into the yard. "Guess I didn't see it that way." "You didn't want to," I said, quieter now. We didn't speak again for a long time. The rain stopped, leaving only the sound of water dripping from the eaves. Then he sighed, deep and tired. "You know, when that judge said your name, Commander Carter, I didn't even recognize it." "I barely recognized you either," I said gently. He let out a dry chuckle. "Fair enough." When we went inside, Mom had already set the table. Everything was in its old place, mashed potatoes on the left, gravy in the blue bowl with a chip that had been there since I was 8. She poured iced tea, then sat down beside him. For a moment it almost felt normal. They asked questions, small ones, ordinary ones. "How's your leg? Still aches when it rains? You living alone out there, just me and Knox?" When I mentioned the dog, Mom smiled. "You always did take in the broken ones." I smiled back. Guess I became one. Dad looked down at his plate. "You're not broken," he said quietly. "You're just different now." "Maybe," I said, "but I'm still yours." He swallowed, hard eyes glinting just enough to make me look away. "Didn't think you'd ever say that again." After dinner, we stood on the porch, watching the clouds drift apart. A faint streak of gold stretched across the horizon, lightning flickering somewhere far off. The air smelled like wet dirt and wood smoke. "You remember," Dad said slowly, "that night before you left for boot camp, I told you not to go." I remember. I was wrong. The words were so simple, but they hit harder than any apology could. He reached into his pocket and pulled something small and worn. "Your grandfather's compass," he said, handing it to me. "He left it to me, but I think it belongs to you now." I opened it. The needle still pointed steady north. Inside the lid, faintly etched, were the words, "Honor is the only direction that never changes." My throat tightened. "Thank you, Dad." He nodded once, then put his hand on my shoulder, firm, awkward, real. When I left that night, the porch light stayed on behind me. Halfway down the drive, I looked in the rearview mirror. They were both standing in the doorway, side by side. No waves, no words. But for the first time, I didn't need either. Back home, I placed the compass beside my folded uniform. The brass caught the light, casting a soft golden glow across the room. Knox thumped his tail once and sighed contentedly. The war between us was over. Not won, not lost, just over. And that I realized was its own kind of victory. The weeks after that dinner felt like spring breaking through winter, slow, cautious, but certain. The kind of change you don't notice until one morning you wake up and realize the air smells different. The farmhouse was nearly restored by then. Fresh paint on the porch, new window panes, a mended swing that creaked softly when the wind moved through. Each day I worked until my hands ached, sanding, painting, replacing old boards that had rotted through. Every stroke of the brush, every nail hammered down, felt like stitching a wound that had been open too long. Sometimes, between the sound of the hammer and Knox's slow breathing nearby, I'd think of my grandfather. I'd picture him in those same overalls, whistling off-key while he worked. He used to tell me, "Eve, when you fix something, do it like you plan to keep it forever." Maybe that's what I was doing, fixing not just a house, but a piece of myself I'd left behind. One Friday afternoon, as I was sealing the porch railing, a car pulled into the driveway. I squinted against the sunlight. It was Dad's truck, but this time he wasn't alone. Mom stepped out of the passenger side, then my brother Ryan climbed down from the back seat holding a casserole dish like an offering. I wiped the paint from my hands and met them halfway. "Wasn't expecting a crowd," I said, trying to sound casual. Mom smiled, faint but genuine. "We thought we'd see the place before you finished it." Dad gave a small shrug. "Your mother's idea." Ryan looked around, hands in his pockets. "Smells like paint and coffee. Grandpa would have loved that." "He would," I said. Ryan nodded slowly. "You did all this yourself, mostly," I said. "Took a while." He kicked the dirt lightly with his boot the way he used to do when we were kids and didn't know what to say. "Looks good," he said. "Real good." It was just 3 words, but for a family that used to speak mostly in criticism, it felt like thunder. We ate dinner on the porch that evening, chicken cornbread, and that casserole Ryan's wife had insisted on bringing. The air was warm, full of the hum of crickets and the smell of cut grass. Conversation came in slow waves, hesitant but honest. Mom asked about my leg again, then my work at the Veterans Center. Dad mostly listened. Every now and then I'd catch him glancing around the porch, the railing, the swing, the fresh coat of navy blue paint, and I could see the pride trying to find its way through the cracks of his stubbornness. When the plates were nearly empty, Dad lifted his glass of sweet tea. His voice was rough, almost uncertain. "To the Carters," he said, "and to the one who finally made us proud." For a moment I froze. The air seemed to still. Then slowly I raised my glass too. "To the ones who taught me what pride really costs." Mom's eyes glistened, but she smiled through it. "That's a toast your grandfather would have liked." We sat there under the fading light, fireflies blinking in the fields, the sky painted in violet and gold. It wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be. For the first time, I didn't feel like a guest or an outcast. I just felt home. After they left, I stayed on the porch watching the taillights disappear down the gravel road. The house stood quiet and strong behind me, not a relic anymore, but a beginning. I ran my fingers over the rail where my grandfather's faint carving still read, "Strength without anger." Maybe that was what this was all about. Not revenge, not proving anyone wrong. Just strength, the kind that doesn't come from medals or ranks, but from knowing when to let go. I thought back to that day in court, the judge's whisper, my father's silence, the way the room had frozen when they finally saw me for who I was. I'd spent so many years chasing that moment of recognition. But now that I'd had it, I didn't crave it anymore. Sometimes dignity isn't about being seen, it's about knowing who you are when no one's looking. The next morning, the town invited me to speak at the local high school for Veterans Week. The principal, a kind woman with silver hair and bright eyes, met me at the door and shook my hand warmly. "This means a lot to the students," she said. "Not many people from Portsmouth have seen the world the way you have." The gym smelled like fresh polish and new sneakers. Rows of teenagers sat in the bleachers, fidgeting, whispering, bored the usual, until the principal announced, "This is Commander Evelyn Carter, Navy SEAL, one of our own." The gym fell silent. A few students sat up straighter. Even the restless ones stopped tapping their shoes. I stepped up to the microphone, took a breath, and began. "I used to think honor was about medals," I said, "but I learned that it's about choices, especially the ones you make when nobody's watching." I told them about my grandfather, about the farmhouse, about forgiveness. I didn't mention the lawsuit or the bitterness or the years of silence. They didn't need that. They needed to know that strength isn't anger, that sometimes the loudest thing you can do is stay calm. When I finished, the students stood not out of formality but respect. The sound of their applause echoed through the gym like the tide coming in. As I walked out, the principal touched my arm. "They'll remember that," she said softly. "So will I." That night I drove back to the farmhouse under a sky full of stars, sharp, endless quiet. I parked the truck, stepped out, and looked up at the old flag fluttering over the porch. The North Star shimmered faintly above it, steady as ever. Inside the house smelled of fresh wood and coffee. I took out my grandfather's compass from my pocket, opened it, and smiled at the words inside. "Honor is the only direction that never changes." Beneath it I had carved something new: "Forgiveness is the truest form of discipline." Knox rested his head on my knee, sighing as if the world had finally settled where it belonged. I whispered into the quiet, "Grandpa, I think you can rest now." The wind moved softly through the oak trees, a low, steady hush, almost like an answer. That night, for the first time in my life, I didn't dream about war or judgment or silence. I dreamed about home, not the place I left, but the one I rebuilt. By late autumn, the Virginia air had turned sharp again. The mornings were cold enough for breath to show the kind of weather that carried the sound of church bells and hammers from far away. The farmhouse was finally finished. New shutters, freshly painted, siding, a repaired roof that no longer groaned when it rained. The flag out front caught the wind with a soft ripple. It didn't hang like a symbol anymore. It lived like everything else here. Knox was slower now, his muzzle gone gray, but he still followed me everywhere, limping through the yard, curling up at my boots whenever I sat on the porch. I'd sometimes talk to him like he could answer. "We did it," I'd say. He'd blink tail thump once, as if to remind me that maybe I hadn't done it alone. One afternoon I found myself sanding the last piece of porch trim when a truck I didn't recognize turned up the road. I shaded my eyes. Out stepped Ryan, carrying a wooden box. He grinned, an older, more humble version of the brother I used to know. "Mom said you might want this," he said, setting it down on the porch. Inside was an old photograph album, yellowed pages, edges worn soft with time. I flipped through black and white shots of my grandfather in uniform family picnics in the yard, a photo of Dad as a boy holding a hammer twice his size. Then one of me, maybe 6 years old, sitting on Grandpa's lap with sawdust in my hair and pride in his eyes. Ryan leaned against the post, watching. "He loved you more than anyone you know." "I know," I said quietly, "but it wasn't about more. It was just different." He nodded. "Dad talks about you now. He doesn't say much, but when he does, it's not angry anymore." That surprised me more than I wanted to admit. "Guess we're all learning how to talk again," I said. Ryan smiled faintly. "He's still him. You know, stubborn as a brick wall. I wouldn't recognize him otherwise." He laughed, then glanced toward the horizon. "We're all heading over Sunday. You should come. Mom's making that casserole you always hated." I smirked. "Then it's really a peace offering." He gave me a look that was half apology, half brotherly teasing. "You coming?" "I'll be there." He nodded, once climbed into the truck and drove off, leaving dust swirling behind him. I stood there a long while, flipping through the photo album. Somewhere deep in those pages was a story I'd finally stopped running from. Sunday came, and with it something close to peace. The Carters, all of us sitting around that same old table, passing dishes and soft smiles instead of arguments. The laughter was still awkward, the pauses still long, but the edges had softened. At one point, Mom said, "You know, your father never admits when he's wrong, but he kept that compass on his nightstand." Dad cleared his throat. "It's a good compass," he muttered. "Keep steady." Ryan raised his glass. "To steady things, then." We all lifted ours. No speeches, no drama, just a quiet understanding that forgiveness doesn't erase history, it rewrites it. After dinner, I stood on the porch alone watching the stars push through the dusk. The same porch where we'd once stood angry and broken now felt sacred, like a bridge built plank by plank. The sound of laughter drifted from inside, soft and real. I thought of the judge, the courtroom, that first moment of silence when my title echoed across the room. Back then I thought victory would taste like vindication. But standing here, it tasted like calm. A week later, I got a call from the local Veterans Center. They were hosting a small event, a remembrance ceremony for service members who'd never made it home. They asked if I'd speak. That night I sat at my desk staring at a blank page. What could I possibly say that hadn't been said 1,000 times before? Then I remembered the last words my grandfather carved into that beam beneath the porch rail: strength without anger. That was it. That was everything. At the ceremony, the crowd was small, maybe 40 people, veterans, families, students. I wore my khakis, not the full uniform. When I took the podium, I didn't read from notes. I once thought honor was about rank, I began. About medals and titles and the way people look at you when you walk into a room. But I learned something else. Real honor is quieter. It's the way you carry yourself when no one's clapping. It's showing up for others and for yourself, even when you're tired, even when no one believes in you yet. Faces in the crowd nodded, eyes glistened. An older man in a wheelchair saluted. I saluted back. When I walked into a courtroom not long ago, I continued. Someone said, "My God, is that really her?" It took me years to realize the answer wasn't about who they saw. It was about who I'd finally become. Honor doesn't demand recognition. It just asks that you live in a way that would make the people who believed in you proud, even if they're long gone. When I stepped down, people clapped, but I barely heard it. What mattered was the quiet afterward, that stillness that feels like understanding. That evening I drove to the harbor. The sunset painted the sky in soft orange and pink, the water catching every color like glass. I sat on the pier where I'd once boarded my first deployment ship, the wind cold but steady on my face. In my pocket, the compass ticked faintly, as it always had, the needle unshaken by distance or time. I turned it over in my hand, tracing the words engraved inside. Honor is the only direction that never changes. Beneath it, my own edition glinted faintly in the dying light. Forgiveness is the truest form of discipline. Knox leaned against me, his head resting heavy on my leg. "We made it," I whispered. He gave a low, content rumble, that kind of sound dogs make when they know they're home. For a while I just sat there listening to the water lap against the dock, the faint hum of a boat engine somewhere far out. The horizon stretched endless calm, and for the first time I didn't feel small against it. I felt whole. If you've been misunderstood, if your family turned away, if silence ever felt heavier than words, remember this. You don't have to shout to be heard. You don't have to fight to prove your worth. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is show up quietly, fully, with grace. Let time do the talking. Let forgiveness be the loudest answer. And if this story reminded you of someone, a parent, a child, a friend you haven't called in years, reach out. Tell them you're still here. Because coming home isn't always about returning to a place. Sometimes it's about returning to yourself.